everyone, and for joining us today for the webinar, Cybersecurity and Remote Learning and Working. This is a reminder that everyone will be muted during the webinar. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. We will devote a time at the end of today's webinar to answer as many questions as possible. I would like to remind you the webinar is being recorded and will be made available at a later date. With that, I'm over to Kathy Gosa.
All right, thank you, Amanda. As Amanda indicated, my name is Kathy Gosa, and I'm with the SLDS State Support Team. In collaboration with our partners at the NCES Forum on Education Statistics, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar regarding cybersecurity and remote learning and working. With much of the nation transition to connecting remotely in response to the coronavirus pandemic, the challenges and the need for effective practices regarding cybersecurity have skyrocketed. Today I'm pleased to introduce Dean Folkers, the Information Systems Officer with Nebraska Department of Education and the current chair of the forum, who will provide an overview of the forum and will introduce our featured speaker. Before Dean takes over, I do want to remind you that we've reserved time at the end of the webinar to respond to questions you have, so please be sure to enter those into the Q&A panel throughout the presentation. In addition, we have a couple of panels on your screen to get some feedback, first of all on your role, and then also regarding some of your organization's security practices. So if you please go ahead and share your responses in those panels, that would be awesome. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dean.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. So it is indeed an exciting opportunity for us to share with you today this information. As Kathy mentioned, my name is Dean Folkers. I serve as the chair of the National Forum on Education Statistics and the Information Systems Officer at the Nebraska Department of Education. As Kathy welcomed you, I am also pleased to welcome you to today's collaborative webinar between the National Forum on Education Statistics and the Statewide Longitudinal Data System, or SLDS, grant program. These collaborations are an effective opportunity for us to have connections and convergence of high priority and important topics. The National Forum on Education Statistics is an important organization that helps provide support for both local education agencies as well as state education agencies and our federal partners that are a part of and supporting elements of data collections, data use, and the pieces around that process. As you know, and Kathy had mentioned, cybersecurity is an important topic for the education community. Last fall, the forum convened a working group of SEA and LEA practitioners to develop a new resource on cybersecurity. And cybersecurity remains a priority for education agencies during this pandemic. Given that transition of many of our organizations, if not all, to some version of remote working and learning, these present some unique challenges to and new opportunities for strengthening cybersecurity. Today, it is indeed an exciting opportunity for us to hear from Stephen Hernandez on cybersecurity and remote learning and working. Stephen is the Chief Information Security Officer and the Director of Information Assurance Services for the U.S. Department of Education. He is responsible for maintaining the integrity and privacy of the department and coordinating and integrating all aspects of the department's cybersecurity, telecommunications, and information security programs. So join me in welcoming Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us today to provide key information on this extremely important and timely topic.
Thank you so much, Dean, and good afternoon, everyone. I can't thank you enough for inviting me to talk about a very important topic. COVID has been an earth-shattering change for most of us, not only in our professional lives, but in our personal lives as well. And it's incredible how our adversaries and attackers have taken advantage of this situation and tried to adapt their forms of attack to basically get access to the most sensitive information that's important to us and therefore also important to them. So I'm very pleased to give you a perspective today. I'm going to provide a federal perspective on cybersecurity during COVID-19, particularly as it relates to working remotely, and then some of the challenges and opportunities we have in that space to protect ourselves and make sure that, especially when we're working with confidential or sensitive information, we're able to do so with confidence that we're not going to accidentally disclose it or open ourselves up for attack. Our agenda today, I'm going to go into an overview of the present threatscape. What are we seeing at the federal level? And one of the advantages of being a cabinet-level agency is we have very deep intelligence that we can reach into, whether it's through our partners at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency at DHS, our friends over at the National Security Agency, or even our friends at the FBI or the Secret Service. We have relationships with all these folks, and so whether it's external threats, internal threats, domestic, or foreign, we have a very good view as to what's happening in our own department, but also in general globally in the education sector. And so I do want to provide what we're seeing in terms of the threat actors, what they're focusing on, and then also get into some of the best practices that we can engage in while we're working through the COVID situation and evolving how we work through this situation. I'll touch on some federal resources that are available to folks, and especially for folks, state, local, tribal type of affiliation. These are valuable resources that are good to know about, and in most cases, these are folks you want to have at least a contact or a relationship with before the uh-oh happens, before the boom happens, so that you have an idea of kind of where they can fit into your response equation, or in some cases, your proactive equation. And then finally, we'll of course have some time for Q&A. As was noted earlier, we have a Q&A panel available in the Adobe Connect window here, so feel free to ask any questions you may have there, and we'll address them as we go through. So a little bit about me. That was a great introduction by Dean. I don't know that I can add much more. Also served on the not-for-profit side, been on the board of directors, heavy in the privacy space and the healthcare prior to this, and also law enforcement, working with an inspector general's office. So a broad background, and it brings a very good perspective from that network. What you see in front of you now, slide 8, is actually our most recent notification that we sent out to our users here at the department, our population. And this is based on getting inputs from all those different directions and all those different perspectives, and saying, from the department perspective, what does our everyday user need to know about? And we saw two major themes. The first theme is that cyber criminals are actively targeting many of the tools that we're using to thrive and get through this COVID situation. So some in particular, we saw, of course, Zoom. That's the most popular platform right now, and so therefore it's also the most attractive from an attacker perspective. But we also saw some other platforms like House Party, Zoho Meeting, to name a few, that were also under attack. Some because they're newer to the market space and therefore they may not have had as much security rigor like House Party, or Zoho Meeting, where it's been around for a while, but just in its native capabilities, it's not as easy to configure, and therefore most people don't. So there's attacks on those platforms, and then there's also thousands of phishing sites that have been created to either imitate these providers and try to get you to hold a meeting in an insecure service that looks very similar to one of these providers, or in some cases, fraudulent billing. Folks saying, hey, we know you're using Zoom, and you need to pay us if you want to keep using it. And this is kind of a form of a business email compromise attack where attackers are trying to get money out of organizations that are trying to get acclimated to these new ways of working. Lots of malicious websites, lots of malware, lots of ransomware. One of the things I will note about ransomware that's been interesting is in terms of state and local governments, we've actually seen a decline in ransomware attack during the COVID situation. Whether that's the mercy of the attackers, which I find unlikely, is one theory. I think the other theory is simply they know that most state and local folks won't even have the capacity to play the game at this point. You shut us down, okay, it's going to be a long time before we get back up, and clearly we don't have the revenues to pay you. So the good news is right now if you're state local, at least on the ransomware front, you've got a little bit of a reprieve. But everything else that I've noted here about eavesdropping, Zoom bombing, compromising commercially free services, all of these still are in play for you. And for us, it was really about making sure that our users understood that we have authorized and approved services. Here at the department, we primarily use Skype, Teams, and then we also leverage WebEx for large conferencing. And letting folks know that there's a difference. Those three solutions I just mentioned had been through rigorous security assessment through several years. We've reviewed those risks. We've configured those platforms. We know who's in and who's out, and we have the logs, and we can show how that happens. Once we step outside of that boundary, and we start to use solutions that are either no cost or that the department has not formally approved, we lose all of that visibility and we lose the ability to understand what's happening in those environments. So making sure folks understood the difference between what an approved and viable solution is for us during this time and then where we needed to exercise caution was a vital strategy in moving us forward. A lot of updates have been sent out, but the ones that we find most interesting have come from a joint effort between the United Kingdom and our own infrastructure security agency, CISA. They're a part of the Department of Homeland Security. And on the next few slides, I want to summarize some of their findings, which are very consistent with even information I have back in the intelligence and classified side about what we're seeing during the COVID situation. And so if you Google that alert, you can see it in all of its full glory. It's a great alert. Highly recommend folks who are interested in this space get this alert in its entirety. What we're going to see and that we continue to see is, one, anytime that we're in a state of great change, our emotions get involved. And sometimes we feel anxious, sometimes we feel threatened, sometimes we feel exhausted. I've heard that one, or I felt that one a lot myself. And what that means is that we're not able to rationally process things as quickly and as accurately as we used to. And our attackers are taking full advantage of this situation. We've seen phishing using either the coronavirus or COVID-19 as a lure. In some cases, this has been tied to stimulus checks or attempts to get information around stimulus checks, collect PII and financial information from folks. We've seen malware distribution also using COVID. Hey, this is your IT or your IT department. We've just rolled out a brand new teleconferencing system. Please double click on this software and install it. A massive surge of new domain names containing words related to coronavirus to imitate legitimate government websites. And then what we've seen is as agencies are standing up new capabilities, especially around the teleworking space, the attackers are right there. They are watching for these new instances to be stood up because unfortunately what happens is we're in a hurry. We try to stand something up quickly to get immediate action and a quick win. But sometimes we forget to change the lock on the door. Sometimes we forget to configure the least privilege. Sometimes we forget to make sure that only our users can use it and that by default we need things like passwords to enter meetings. And when that happens, the attackers have been there ready to exploit that situation and take action. We've also seen a big push on the social engineering side. So business email compromise relies on a considerable amount of social engineering. And one of the interesting aspects, as the FBI likes to remind us, is that in the business email compromise, there's often phone calls that take place to try to groom a particular user to perform a specific action. We've seen this same behavior with the COVID situation. And most of the time, it's related to downloading and installing malware or ransomware. The example provided there, malicious Android app purports to provide real-time corona outbreak tracker, but instead tricks the user into providing administrative access and installs COVID lock ransomware on their device. We even have ransomware now that's named after the event. And then, of course, we have the malicious attachments that might come as a coronavirus update or coronavirus outbreak in your city, emergency. And in many cases, we have found that the attackers are able to customize these phishing emails, and in some cases, even avenues that we haven't seen before, such as text, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. Oftentimes, they're exploiting organizations that have authority in this space, such as the World Health Organization. At the state level, you can think of your own departments of health and welfare. They're imitating domains that look very similar to those particular organizations, and oftentimes they will use the term doctor as the person sending it. So if you're building profiles around what these attacks are looking like, there's some good information in this alert that speaks to basically who they're imitating and what the structures are and what are the triggers and the lures they're using to get people to click on malicious attachments and links. You'll also see that they're talking about budgets. Budgets are a very contentious topic right now, especially in the government space and the not-for-profit sector. Basically, do we have the right funds at the right times to make sure that we're going to be able to carry on with our mission? And we've certainly seen that our threat actors have keyed in on that, and they're making good use of it. Another interesting aspect is, as people are working from home now, our attackers have recognized that texting is almost as effective as email. And so we've started to see attackers leverage texting. They will get the phone numbers from email correspondence or through directories that are online, and they will actually send folks text messages with links that will go to a malicious website, which will then attempt to compromise the device. You'll see here they leverage the UK COVID-19 as part of that URL. Of course, those of us who are savvy and do our awareness training know that webdirect.org is probably not a good site that we want to go to. That would be something suspicious that we would need to address. So making sure your user population is conditioned and aware of the texting vector is very important. Even in our own department, we focus primarily on email, and email being one of the primary conduits for this type of exploitation. But under the COVID situation, we've definitely seen an increased interest and an increased action with texting, both to personal devices and government devices. Had you actually followed that link, you would have went to this website, which is a phishing website, very well constructed. It mirrors the actual website in terms of design, color, format, layout, almost perfectly. And what you're going to see is, go ahead and enter in a postcode. They typically ask for a few simple things first, and then they'll start asking the hard questions. First name, last name, social security number, what's your adjusted gross income, etc., to try to harvest a more complete picture of the victim. So know that the credential harvesting and information harvesting is out there, but the attacks are certainly blended now, phone calls and texting in many cases. The credential theft we've discussed that thoroughly. Phishing for malware deployment, and then the last one is really around that new technologies and services. I loved seeing about the use of VPN in the survey responses. That's fantastic. That's an absolutely necessary tool. We are also seeing a big uptake in virtual desktop technologies. These are things like Citrix. You have to make absolutely sure that when you're standing up those type of technologies, a couple things are in place. One, patching. Citrix, as an example, just had a massive vulnerability a few months ago, which could allow compromise to the environment, and unfortunately, they weren't able to patch it for almost a month. In between the announcement and then the actual patch being deployed. So all of these tools, including your VPN concentrators, sometimes it's easy to overlook them. Well, they're a security appliance. Why would I ever need to patch them? They have patches too, and they need patches. So as we stand up infrastructure and we maintain that infrastructure, we need to make sure that we're keeping those patches up to date. Additionally, multi-factor authentication. There should be little to no reason why any deployment of VPN or remote desktop solution is not requiring the use of multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication can be a phone call now with a robot voice telling you what the code is. It can be SMS, it can be text, it can be an app on your phone that you use as that third factor to get in. So username, password, and a third factor. If your organization is not using multi-factor authentication to access your remote teleworking capabilities, chat with your IT folks and see why not. In many cases, these technologies are either very low cost, and in some cases, depending on the technology, due to COVID, vendors have made that capability available at no cost to folks. And all of this really boils down to what we like to call the watering hole attack. And much like out on the Sahara, if you're a lion, the best place to hang out is right by the water. We see him sitting back there, or actually that's probably a her based on the mane. We see her sitting back there just waiting, and the good news is dinner comes to you. And our attackers think the very similar ways. And so they're looking at how can I imitate Zoom? How can I redirect people who think they're going to Zoom? How can I redirect people who may think they're going to their VPN? How can I redirect people who may think they're going, for example, for us, they're going to go and make sure that their loans are taken care of for the next 6 months. And so another part of your monitoring the threat environment is making sure that within your own program space and your program areas, if you start getting hints that, it appears that somebody, people are talking about a website, but that doesn't quite sound like ours, take that seriously. That's something you need to follow up on and understand what site are those folks going to. And then if you've identified them, we'll talk about some of the contacts that you can work through to basically hopefully get that site taken down so folks are not distracted over there. And even in the meantime, even if we can't take the site down, we can certainly communicate with our end users, informing them that the threat environment has evolved and we need to make sure that you're going to the correct site, and here's how you know what the correct site is. Little bit about what we're doing with our folks to make sure that they're leveraging technology's capabilities to keep us safe. And basically, as I alluded to earlier, if your organization has approved teleconferencing services, those should always be your first right of refusal. If you can use the official and sanctioned solution, use that. But also make sure you've configured it correctly. Require password for entry, or use a lobby and only allow known attendees. If you're having something with a sensitive topic, you may even want to consider sending out one-time passwords to the participants. So if I'm meeting with 3 or 4 folks and I'm not going to get video as part of this conference, I will text to them, hey, you're apple, you're pear, you're zebra, and you're the walrus. And then I will ask them during the call, what is your passphrase? And go through each one. And if they can't answer, I boot them right out of the meeting. So there's some very low-tech ways that we can provide assurance of who's attending our meetings and to make sure that we can confirm their identity. If the solution you're using supports closing or locking your conference, once you know you have all the right participants, close the door. It's just like the old college professor, you know, at 9 a.m., I'm closing that door and locking it, no one else comes in. It's a great way to make sure that you don't have folks that slip in after the start and are able to eavesdrop on what you're discussing. Understand how you remove participants, and this goes 2 ways. 1, if they're simply unknown and you want to boot them out. But 2, sometimes you know, folks start a conference and then they you know, hop in their car and they throw their phone in the glove box, and you get to hear all that wonderful noise, and it's clear that they're not aware that it's happening. So it gives you the opportunity to remove disruptions as well. When you're sharing your screen, always share in this order whenever possible. If you can only share the file, just share it. Much like the Adobe here, you're only seeing the presentation. That's the most secure because you're limiting what folks can see. If you can't do that, then share just the application. So if it's PowerPoint or if it's Word, whatever the case may be, if your solution allows you to do it, restrict there. And then finally, the last thing you should show is your desktop. And that's simply because most of us have things on the desktop or in other windows that are open or whatnot that could be sensitive. And this is about making sure we restrict information and making sure that if somebody got into the meeting that shouldn't have been there, that what we exposed to them was minimal. If you're on a webcam, definitely consider blurring, replacing, or certainly being aware of your background. If I had my camera on, you would see in my office I have a whiteboard behind me. Right now that whiteboard is blank, but I've been in several other meetings where that whiteboard was not blank, and there were lots of interesting things going on in that particular organization. So be aware of what you're displaying, and then leverage the background and the blur when you can. And then finally, inform participants as to whether or not taking screenshots is okay. Most phones, laptops, computers, it's a click of a button, or Windows Shift S, and I can take a snippet or a screenshot of anything that's on my screen. If you have sensitive information, it's good just to level set with folks in the very beginning of the meeting and remind them that it's not appropriate to screenshot. Some of the web conferencing technologies allow you to configure that. And so if your conferencing technology supports it, consider leveraging it for sensitive meetings. If you're the attendee, always double check that URL of the meeting you think you're attending. Double check and make sure that it looks like the right organization. When you get in the meeting, like this one, I loved how we started. We started a little early, and then we just had some informal conversation between the presenters. And that's fantastic because I was quickly able to determine, yes, these are the folks I've been working with on this presentation. I know I'm in the right space. Make sure your client software is up to date. Zoom in particular had a problem a few weeks ago where their desktop client, if it was attacked in a certain way, could basically allow the harvesting of Windows credentials. And then prior to that, their client also had a challenge where it set up an insecure web server on Apple devices, Mac devices. So all of that has been patched according to the vendor up to date, but if you're not on the latest version of their particular endpoint client, you're vulnerable. And so it's very important that you keep that endpoint client up to date for whatever solution you're using. And if you have worries about that, consider using the web interface. Almost all these solutions allow you to join through just a web browser, and the web browser interfaces are kept up to date because they're loaded in real time. And then finally, if you're not hosting the meeting and this is advice that we've given our own folks, if you're not hosting the meeting on one of our approved platforms, assume that everything you share will be recorded and potentially made public. We also had some challenges where some of the Zoom commercial space that was publicly reported that they were, one, routing traffic to China and issuing encryption keys from China, which effectively meant if the government wanted to, and we have no evidence that they have, but if the government wanted to, they could effectively listen into any conversation that met those two criteria. So some organizations are very strict about what they'll allow for conferencing. Others are pretty wide open. If you're more on the wide open side, it's very important that users control the information that they're going to share and make sure that they leverage the right platforms. Some of the best practices here, I will say that at the Department of Education, we, particularly around Zoom, we chose to temporarily block Zoom in our enterprise, especially after most of the public reports came out about the endpoint concerns, and also just some of the concerns about how they were routing and handling traffic. And so, having said that, we're also working with Zoom and their security team to basically get some assessment work done and get some assurances that for our particular use in the Department of Education, that we're comfortable going forward. And the key is you're going to hear a lot of different organizations saying, well, we allow solution X and it's just fine, but we've blocked solution Y and it's not going to match up with, well, what the Department of Education is doing. We always have to remember that when it comes to security, it's a multifaceted approach. We have threats looking to exploit vulnerabilities with a likelihood of success leading to undesirable impacts. And therefore, it's hard to compare apples to apples because some folks may be in an environment where, frankly, even if the endpoint client is vulnerable, they don't care because they have certain sandboxing technologies in place that can compensate for that. Other organizations may say, well, we don't really care if China has access to what we're talking about. In fact, probably all the better. This is something they probably need to hear. And so you really have to understand your own organization and its mission and what you're trying to accomplish when you think about how you're going to manage what you're allowing in your organization in terms of technology, both from what you're sanctioning from a authorized hosting perspective, like in the Department of Education, we have our 3 solutions, but also in some cases, what you're going to allow on your endpoint devices, your laptops, your desktops, your mobile devices, and then even folks joining meetings, what guidance you're going to give out for them as well. And unfortunately, I wish I had a great answer that said if you blocked X, Y, and Z, you're going to be in great shape, but clearly based on what we've just walked through, it's a little more complicated than that. But with any type of mission, especially data-focused missions, you want to remember some key areas. One, least function. Make sure that as we meet, as we're leveraging our tools remotely, and especially as we're granting privileges, we're only giving access to the information that's needed. And that goes with privilege as well. Who has access to what systems, especially from a system administrator perspective. Remote access to system administration is the #1 attack vector for folks looking to get into an organization. In fact, the favorite way to do it is find an admin surfing the web or checking their email on a server on a web browser. That is the easiest way into an organization, bar none, when least privilege and least function are not enforced. Consider de-identification of information that you're having during these meetings at any point where you can. If it's not absolutely necessary, get it out of there. And then make sure you're retaining what has actually occurred in these meetings so that if you need to follow up with law enforcement or incident response later, you have some good ideas about what happened. And most of these programs allow the opportunity or the ability to, one, record system level information, who joined from what number or whether they were online, what IP address they came from. If you don't have that type of logging turned on, look at your solution and see if it supports it. And if it does, consider turning it on. The next ones are a little more organizationally aligned. Make sure you have a plan before intrusions happen. Make sure you have the technology and services in place, which folks are doing that now. Make sure your incident response has gone through your legal counsel, and make sure they understand the technologies you're using and what risks might be involved in those. Engage with law enforcement before an incident. In those cases, particularly, there have been some cases through Zoom bombing and others where illegal pornographic material was displayed during the meeting, and law enforcement needed to get involved quickly and understand how did this happen and what evidence did they need to collect. Having those contacts in advance, at least knowing who folks are in your particular area, is very useful when those type of incidents occur, because we're able to get on the case sooner than later and hopefully bring that person to justice. And then there's an opportunity for cyber information sharing programs, this forum being one, of course, but there are several more out there. The EDUCAUSES of the world, the REN ISACs that are out there, great resources of information to keep on track of, especially local events or local occurrences that might impact your threat posture. If you're acquiring new systems and services, definitely consider software as a service as much as possible as your kind of first right of refusal. Reason being is your security stack is almost entirely dependent on your provider, which sounds scary, but here again, if we can get the right configuration and the right capabilities, it's awesome because it's already built, it's already running. It's just a matter of us tuning and maintaining it and making sure it works. If you're a state, local, federal, or tribal, definitely leverage FedRAMP systems if you can. You might not always be able to leverage GSA contracts to buy the FedRAMP version of a system, but you should always be able to get into the FedRAMP environment, which is separate from the commercial environment and offers considerably more security and, frankly, just a community. Okay, I got a note that the link isn't working. I'll make sure that's updated. Thank you. And then in the education space, EDUCAUSE has what they call the HICVAC, which is the Higher Education Cloud Vendor Assessment Tool. It sounds like my link got broken in the slide, but it's a great tool, freely available for folks to use as you're looking at cloud solutions and some of the trade spaces there. On the federal side, of course, we have the U.S. Department of Education. Studentprivacy.ed.gov is one of our primary sites that we provide information about what we're seeing in the threat space. The FBI has several resources. They have the IC3, which is the Internet Crime Complaint Center, and their local field offices. So, you know, if you were to be if you had a compromise and the powers that be in your organization felt that this is important for the federal investigation team to know about, the IC3 is where you could report those types of complaints. There's local field offices that the FBI has, and it's good to at least establish contact and know who these folks are. Because if you're in a situation where the FBI will be involved, the local field office is who's going to be coming in. And then there's InfraGard, which is an FBI-sponsored cybersecurity threat group where industry, state, local, and federal folks can join. These are groups that get together and talk about what they're seeing in the cyberspace, in the criminal activity space, on a regional and national level. You have the MS-ISAC, the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, a great source of threat information across the state and locals. And then the Secret Service is also a source of information, particularly around financial crime. So if you have situations of money laundering or if you have situations of financial fraud that involve information technology, there are times where they can come in and provide support as well. They have their Electronic Crimes Task Force, and that's the link at the bottom of the slide 21 there. DOJ has best practices for victim response or reporting of cyber incidents. And NSA has their top 10 cyber mitigation strategies. Those are fantastic for when you're building out technology as a quick 10 things to keep your eye on. And then more information about the FedRAMP program can be found at that link, including no-cost training to understand how the program works and why it's such a great idea for all government folks, federal, state, local, tribal, to be considering FedRAMP platforms. And then we have our friends at CISA, the Cyber Infrastructure and Security Agency. They are part of DHS, and they offer no-cost services around cyber hygiene. So as you're working and standing up these new solutions, almost all these solutions are going to be internet-facing, whether they're VPN or whether they're remote desktop services. You can ask CISA to scan those for you. And on a weekly basis, they'll go and they'll scan them, and you'll start getting reports in a couple weeks. And if they find vulnerabilities in your solutions, you'll have a report showing, oh, I need that patch, or oh, I have that port open and I shouldn't. It's a great resource. They also offer phishing campaign assessments, a PCA, where you can ask them to basically phish your employees. And they'll create phishing exercises. They'll send them out. They'll see who clicks, and they'll give you a report. Give you a report back. So another no-cost way of helping ensure that your users are practicing good cyber hygiene and also making good decisions. And that's what I've got for folks today. I think I've left about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So how are we going to facilitate the Q&A process? I guess that's my question to the facilitator.
Dean, did you want to do a little wrap-up?
Thank you so much.
And then we'll go into the question and answer session.
Yes, no, that's terrific. So Stephen, thank you very much. When I first heard you present at the forum meeting a couple of years ago, I was overwhelmed with your knowledge and insights and a little afraid. But ultimately, there's always a sense of reassurance and perspective of solutions that are low cost or no cost, and an opportunity for us to be reassured and that we're all in this together. So thank you again for your time today. Kathy will be facilitating the Q.
Great. Thank you, Dean. And Stephen, thank you so much. As Dean said, we really appreciate the tremendous presentation and all the resources, and definitely appreciate the benefit from your significant expertise and skills. I'm not seeing a lot of questions yet in the question and answer session, so please feel free to continue entering those. We'll answer what we can during this webinar, and if there are more questions than we're able to answer, we'll give written responses. So at this point, does anyone please enter your questions? Here's one. Will the slide deck be made available? Absolutely. At the end of the presentation, we'll remind you of the link where that'll be available, but absolutely a recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck will be available to you.
And I'll make sure the links on the slide deck are pointing to the right place. Appreciate that being pointed out.
Great, and we do have a lot of folks on the call, so I would think there would be some questions. Well, so Stephen, let me pose one while they're doing this. You know, I used to be at a state education agency, and I know security was you know, a big part of what we thought about day to day, and I can't imagine you know, these days with the shifts and the additional focus you know, from folks who want to take advantage of the situation. If you had to come up with just like one thing that everybody should remember in order to protect themselves from the current threats, what would that be?
Boy, one thing, that's a good one. At the end of the day, that one thing would be pause. We are in such a hurried environment right now with everybody trying to do their day job and then in addition adapt to this new environment, it's very easy to start your day at 6 a.m. and go nonstop until 6 p.m. and be, oh my gosh, where did my day go? And all the while, largely running on autopilot and clicking through and getting through your agenda and getting through your calendar schedule. I would say the number one thing people can do is find a moment to pause and take that 5 seconds or that 15 seconds when they're setting up the meeting or when they're joining the meeting or when they're leveraging the technology during COVID to say, all right, let me just do a quick spot check and make sure that everything seems okay. That's the number one matter, because it's rarely the technology that fails us. More often than not, folks get caught in a situation where they're rushed, they're hurried, they're tired, they're hungry, they're angry, and they just make the one choice that's not quite where it needs to be. So I would say take a pause.
Stephen, that makes so much sense, and certainly something we can all do. It's not like it requires a lot of technology and is out of our control, so good point. We do have a question. Dean Folkers has asked, what are some considerations for people working remotely and using their personal devices?
So that's a great question, and there's two different sides to that. The first one being, as you're using personal devices, or from an organizational perspective, if you're allowing the use of personal devices, you need to make sure that on your provider side, whether you're using Office 365 or Google Apps or whatever your application, that you need to make sure the containerization is turned on. And what that does is it provides a software protection around a particular application that prevents data from leaking out of it. If you're the one that's using your personal device for work and for joining some of these meetings, whatnot, rule number one, make sure that device is up to date. In Apple, go to your settings, go to your About device, and make sure you don't have any updates waiting. If you're on an Android, it's a similar process. You need to get into the settings, look at your device settings, and hit the, do I have updates? Unfortunately, the mobile device providers are not as aggressive in some cases as like the desktop providers in making sure those updates take place. And the vast majority of the attacks that we've seen towards the personal devices are really focused on out-of-date operating systems. And then also make sure you're going to the App Store or going to the Google Play Store, depending on what platform you're on, and making sure those applications are up to date. And then the third one there, don't jailbreak and don't sideload applications on your device. There's no assurance that by doing so, that from that point on, there's really no assurance that any of the applications you have are going to be safe or secure. You follow those practices, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. The last one I would say is be cognizant of the data that you're pulling down on your device from your work environment. And back to least function, least privilege, don't keep it there longer than you have to. Don't make yourself a target if you don't need to be. Keep the data there for as long as you need it, and then get it back on the cloud and get rid of your local copies whenever you can. That way, if you lose the device, it's not quite as traumatic.
Great advice, Stephen. Thank you so much. We have a question from Wickham Johnstone. With so much interaction and connection with students at home, is it possible that our LEAs are vulnerable from that direction, that is, from the home connection?
Yeah, there's always that chance, and if you're hosting information, there's always an equation between how much you know about the people connecting in and you don't. And it's entirely possible that as you're working with folks from their homes, that they may have compromised devices. And the good news is that most of what we've seen in that space right now, the exposure has been limited to what was presented in the meeting or what was presented to that particular end user is what's vulnerable. We have not seen a lot of backtracking into an enterprise. There's only been one exception with some remote desktop technology where a couple users had keyloggers installed on their machines, and then they used those machines to access remote desktop services. Fortunately, in those cases, in both those cases, multi-factor authentication was a requirement. So while the attacker got the username and the password from the keyboard, they were not able to leverage those credentials to get into the environment because of the multi-factor authentication. So you have to think about that in terms of defense in depth, and where even though you may have a compromised endpoint, how can you minimize exposure of your information, least functionality, least privilege, and then how can you put authentication in place so that even if the two credentials are compromised, username and password, because of the shaky end device, you still have a third that doesn't allow them to be replayed to be used as a toehold to get into your organization.
Great, thank you, Stephen. We have a question from Ken Reynolds. On a grand scale, where would you place proper end user education?
On the grand scale, I would say that is job one. And it's simply because that while technologies, tools, capabilities, these can all evolve and change over time, how we interact and some of the fundamental aspects of the human condition really have not changed. The con artists of 100 years ago have just digitized, and now rather than going door to door or putting nails out to pop your tires on the highways, they're doing it on the digital highway. And the informed user is the most powerful asset we have. In our phishing training at the department level, we look at two things. We look at one, susceptibility, who failed the test because they clicked on the link or downloaded, but the other one is who reported it. And I always explain to my executive team and the leadership of the department that while susceptibility is bad, what's worse is when folks don't report when they see something, because our automated defenses, we take down hundreds, thousands of malicious emails and texts every single day. It's the one or two that slip through that our automated defenses didn't catch. Those are the ones we need to worry about. But the human can detect it. The human can see that something is off. And when they report that back to us, we tear it apart in our malware lab and we inoculate the whole network. So user awareness and user education and training have to be at the forefront of this conversation. And much like you saw, the user can control almost every facet of the information in a meeting or through the remote work situation, and therefore the user has to be the primary conduit by which we help folks, one, understand the threat environment, and two, understand how to make good decisions in that environment. Great question.
Thank you, Stephen. And I see one more question from Bob Swigum. I see that the FCC is considering funding additional connectivity outside of the school campus. Is there any discussion with them to include funding for security monitoring devices?
You know, I sure hope so, but unfortunately, that is not part of my direct area of responsibility. That would be an ideal situation, though, and the good news is that almost all telecommunications equipment now has some intersection with security. And it's really about making sure that as we evolve and we bring in new telecommunications capabilities, that we're also enabling the security technologies that they provide. Much like when we look at IPv4, Internet Protocol version 4, inherently there was no security built into it other than resilience. We could find different ways to route traffic and make sure that we had availability. But when we look at IPv6, we see there is native capability built in around encryption, around integrity, services that were not necessarily considered and not necessarily built into the old version of IPv4. And so while unfortunately I don't have a great answer about the budgeting and everything else. What I will say is that as new technologies are going to be introduced and funded, those new technologies will come with great security technology built in, and then hopefully the discussions with FCC and others will certainly lead to additional capabilities if needed.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephen. I don't see any additional questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move us on a little bit. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation to for the partnership that has brought you this valuable information on today's webinar. The SLDS program and the National Forum on Education Statistics have joined together to disseminate information on joint topics of interest. We have a number of past collaborative efforts that are focused on a variety of topics, including researcher partnerships, personalized learning, leveraging the school courses for exchange of data to support education goals, responding to SEA and LEA needs for virtual learning, and be sure that you have on your calendar our upcoming webinar that's scheduled for Wednesday, May 20th regarding planning for, collecting, and managing data about displaced students. That has some really interesting connections to the coronavirus as well. In addition, some of these may be duplicative of Stephen's links, but I think a number of them may not be. We have some resources here that are specifically the forum's resources with all the publications that they provide as well as their website. We also have a couple of PTAC webinars that speak to this very topic as well and very education related, so the links to those are there as well. I think the ED website was already provided. There's an FAQ site for COVID-19, specifically around FERPA, and then a virtual learning resource. And then you may want to go ahead and sign up for the privacy listserv. The link to do that is also on this slide. And this slide includes contact information for Dean, Stephen, and myself, today's presenters, as well as for Gedem Bairu with the U.S. Department of Education NCES Forum. Gedem and her team worked behind the scenes to make today's webinar successful. Please feel free to use these links if you'd like to dig a little deeper and follow up on some of the questions and topics that you've heard today. Very intriguing and rich set of resources. We've also included some links if you'd like to learn more about the SLDS program and the SLDS state support team. So with that, I think we're ready to wrap up. As we indicated at the start, the webinar recording and the slides will be available on the Communities 360 website. A huge thank you to Dean and to Stephen for their contributions to today's webinar, and to our forum partners, Gedem and her team. And thanks so much to all of you for joining our webinar today. Stay safe.